Hey, boys and girls, this is Mr. Lyles, and I'm going to continue to talk about the United States' involvement in World War One. So, yesterday I went over reasons for the U.S. getting involved in World War One. Now, today we're going to look at how the citizens of the United States and how the civilians of the United States handled the war and mobilized for the war on what we called the U.S. home front. So, we're going to take a look at how the American citizens went through the war here in America. So, first of all, let's define home front. So, home front refers to the people who stay in a country and work while that country's soldiers are fighting in a war in a foreign country. So the home front refers to the people that stay back and support the war at home rather than going to fight on the battlefield. So that would be the soldiers and support material, and the home front would refer to the people that stay home. So, an example of what people do on the home front, they produce war materials and food to supply troops. So, we're going to take more in depth look at that on the U.S. home front during World War One. All right, so the first thing we need to discuss is what we call the Selective Service Act. And the Selective Service Act was a law that allowed the president to draft soldiers in times of war. So Congress had passed the Selective Service Act soon after Woodrow Wilson and Congress declared war in April of 1917. So the backstory on this passage of this act was the United States did not have a large standing army like many of these European countries did at the outbreak of war. If you remember, I discussed in our very first lesson the size of these armies and the growing militarism involved. Well, the United States only had roughly 200,000 active troops ready to go in 1914. So by 1917, not much has changed. The United States was not at war, so there was no need to increase the army. So when 1917 came around and the United States decided to declare war on Germany, only in the first few months, only about 32,000 American men volunteered to sign up for the army, and that wasn't going to be enough. So President Woodrow Wilson he passed this law, or he asked Congress to pass this law, the Selective Service Act, that issued in the draft. And the military draft required all men from the ages of 21 to 30 years old to sign up for the draft. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you would get selected for the draft. It just means that you are in the system to be drafted when called upon. So every male in the United States from 21 to 30 had to sign up through this process. So around 3 million draftees were assembled and trained in a matter of months due to this Selective Service Act. So we go from 32,000 volunteers at the start to 3 million draftees were first or forced recruits into the army. So there's a big difference there. You could see how the draft um, escalated the size of the United States Army and helped us mobilize and prepare for war. Um, so the Selective Service Act is still around today. I know that every 18-year-old, when he turns 18, I myself included, we had to actually register for the Selective Service once we hit 18, just in case there was a draft in the future. And there has not been a mandatory draft since the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War. So uh, there, even though there hasn't been a necessity for a draft, that option still remains to this day, and every 18-year-old boy must sign up once he turns 18. So here's a registration card for a draft card. This is a pretty common document that you can find if you're digging into your family history. your ancestry. I know a lot of websites like Ancestry.com has a lot of these registration cards, these draft cards. So it was, I think, around by the end of World War One, I think about 10 million United States men were drafted. So that gives you an idea of how many are out there and how many family members were drafted in World War One. All right, so a next important aspect of the United States home front was what we call the Committee on Public Information. It's not necessarily important that you need to know and identify this committee. What you need to know, however, is its purpose and what it produced, and that what it produced is what we call propaganda. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the Committee on Public Information established in World War One. So its purpose was to encourage public support for the war effort. Okay, how do we do that? Well, they had to try and quote sell the idea of war to the American people and encourage them to support it in every aspect of life. Now, this doesn't mean literally sell the idea. You can't sell an idea, but they tried to influence public opinion and the American people and encourage them to support it in every aspect of their daily life. So how the Committee on Public Information and the government did this was through what we call propaganda. And propaganda, a simplified definition, it's that to define propaganda is it's information designed to influence an opinion. So if you remember back when we talked about our yellow journalism discussion and how yellow journalism and this sensationalized news that came out during the Spanish American War, we remember how the USS Maine exploded, and you had this wave of yellow journalism that kind of portrayed the Spanish as evil. They kind of, portrayed them committing all these atrocities to the Cubans. Well, that is kind of a form of propaganda. And propaganda during World War One came not necessarily in the form of yellow journalism and this sensationalized news, but it came in the form of posters, pamphlets, radio ads that was really more aggressive in encouraging patriotic messages and support for the war. So propaganda is not just yellow journalism. It's a variety of different outlets for swaying an opinion, and it became very popular and prolific in World War One. And so the question is, how did it encourage support for the war? So it came in a variety of different forms. The first one came through financing the war, which means that it encouraged people to give money to the government for the war effort. And propaganda was used to encourage that. And it came in the instance of promoting what we call war bonds or liberty bonds that I will discuss in more detail. Next thing that it encouraged was recruitment. So we talked about the Selective Service Act was a law that required males to sign up for the Selective Service, but it also propaganda came in the form of recruitment posters, like the Uncle Sam poster, where it's asking for I want you to join the U.S. Army, stuff like that. That's a recruitment poster propaganda that supports the idea that you are joining the war effort through volunteering. So that came in the form of trying to get soldiers, nurses, etc., to join the war. And then also another form of propaganda that encouraged support for the war came in the form of getting the public to conserve resources in the form of rationing food or material, and also growing what we call victory gardens, which I will also discuss in more detail shortly. And then finally, propaganda was used to not only um, encourage support for the war in a variety of ways, it was also used to sway public opinion against your enemy or to demonize the enemy, to portray him as a enemy and a person that you you have to defeat for the sake of humanity or civilization. Those are just an examples of trying to demonize the enemy. So here's a picture of a recruiting propaganda poster, an ad that was used to recruit soldiers and sailors into the U.S. Navy. And it says, "The Navy needs you. Don't read American history, make it." So this message is saying that you shouldn't stay on the sidelines and read about what's going on in the war and history being made. You need to actively participate in it. You need to be there. You need to make history. So this message is recruiting soldiers or men to get off the sidelines and get into the front lines, so to say. And you have this sailor encouraging his friend with the backing of what appears to be a Lady Liberty type figure, representation of liberty and American values. And the sailor has the blessing of this American angel type figure. So you see a lot of this in this propaganda. You have these mythical figures like this lady, and then Uncle Sam is a mythical figure that became very popular during World War I and World War II. So you get an idea of what kind of how propaganda is used. So another committee that was formed was the Food Administration. And it's not necessarily you need to know what the Food Administration was. You just need to know some of the efforts that this Food Administration did during the war. And the Food Administration was established to encourage the U.S. to conserve food for the war effort by increasing food production while at the same time reducing consumption. So the Food Administration tried to encourage families and Americans to grow victory gardens, which was a wartime vegetable garden developed to increase food production, especially by home gardeners. So the Food Administration promoted this idea of victory gardens for every family to have their own victory garden to not only grow food for themselves to save food for the soldiers. You have your own food that you can grow. You don't necessarily need to go and purchase other food. That food that you can get at a grocery store or a farmer's market, that can be sent to the soldiers on the front lines. So the idea is not only to self-sustain and grow your own food, but it was also used to grow your own food to give away. So it was a way for families to chip in for the war effort by growing their own garden and giving the excess food away to the soldiers on the front lines. So you can see how that motivated families and Americans to participate, and it was kind of this coordinated effort through the Food Administration to promote this idea of these victory gardens. And then here's some propaganda posters for the victory gardens. You see, dig for victory, grow your own vegetables. This is clearly saying that the idea is through growing vegetables, you gain victory. And then you have another one that says, plant a victory garden. Our food is fighting. So, again, this is promoting the idea that you grow your own food, you can ration the food, and you can also give that food away, and that helps the soldiers on the front lines. All right, here's another one. Again, food is ammunition. Ammunition, don't waste it. That is promoting the idea that food is necessary for the frontline soldiers. And then this one as well. This is promoting rationing where it says go without so they don't have to. So again, it's promoting rationing to where, like on certain days of the week, for instance, on Mondays, Americans would be asked to ration meat, and the Monday would be called Meatless Mondays. And then on Wednesdays, they would be asked to ration wheat or grain, and those Wednesdays became known as weekless Wednesdays. So you get the idea that rationing was kind of seen as a patriotic duty for Americans to participate in the war effort. And then also having your own victory garden, um, it helped soldiers on the front lines by actually providing food and not wasting food on the home front. All right, and then another thing, another a way that Americans participated on the home front and participated in the war effort was through Liberty bonds, and these bonds they were implemented by the government, um, so to help raise money for the war. So these loans to the government aided its ability to prepare for World War One, and these became known as Liberty bonds. So by buying bonds, Americans were loaning the government money that would be repaid in interest within a specified number of years. So let me explain this in more detail. So a Liberty bond was a an American or American family, they would give money to the government, and in return, the government would give you this bond or this piece of bond, this bond that had a value, and within a certain amount of time, let's say 5 years from the time that you purchase this bond or you give the money to the government, in 5 years' time, the government is going to repay you, and you get interest based on that. So this was kind of an effort to it was a loan um, to the government from the American people, and this money was used for the war effort. And you could see that loaning this money to the government and then getting it back later with interest was kind of was seen as a good motivator or a good initiative to give money for the war effort. So this is another way that propaganda was used and the government was used to encourage Americans to participate on the home front in World War One. So it was very successful. It raised $23 billion for the war effort. So it was very successful in raising billions of dollars through Liberty bonds. And as you can see right here, this is a propaganda poster with our good buddy Uncle Sam. It says, if you can't enlist, invest, buy a Liberty Bond. So this is a direct message saying that if you are a woman or a child or a man that is unable to enlist, the least you can do is invest in the war and buy a Liberty Bond. So it's almost like a guilt trip, like it's almost forcing you to participate and be patriotic in the war effort. And it was kind of used in a way that shunned people from shunned people that did not participate in the war effort. So it kind of it divided the American public because you were seen as patriotic or unpatriotic, and the propaganda during war was very direct in its meaning and caused a lot of division among Americans. Here's another one about Liberty bonds: is every Liberty bond is a shot at a U-boat. Fire your shot today. Buy a Liberty bond. So again, this is promoting the idea that Liberty bonds um, fund um, ammunition that you know, sinks those dreaded U-boats, that unrestricted submarine warfare. A way for you to stop it is to buy Liberty bonds. And then here, like I was saying about how it kind of made you feel guilty for not participating, like you were forced to participate. This is a good example, this poster right here, where it's this little girl and she says, my daddy bought me a government bond of the Third Liberty Loan. Did yours? So it's kind of promoting this idea that, especially young girls, young boys, to be look to fit in with your peers. It's like, oh well, my daddy bought me a Liberty loan. Did yours? Is your daddy special enough to do that for you? That kind of idea. So yeah, you could see how it could cause a lot of division amongst Americans, and propaganda, it has some good uses, but it also had some bad uses. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about, probably one of the most important things on the American home front, is the role of women. And since the war broke out and men are getting drafted, they have to not only go fight on the front lines, but they're also leaving these jobs open, these factories jobs. You also have to produce ammunition. You have to produce materials on the home front. So who is going to make those materials if all the men are out fighting? So that's where women had to step up. Again, like kind of going back to our progressive era unit, where we talked about how women were seen in American society as the homemaker. They were seen as a mother and a good wife. They were not seen as workers outside of the home. So when World War One happened, this really was the first movement where women really in large masses they went out to the workforce and replaced those jobs that the men vacated. And these women took this role and they produced supplies and materials for the war effort, and it was a huge success. And then after the war, now mind you, the war ended in 1918, and pulling back that prior knowledge from our progressive era unit, the 19th Amendment, which gave American women the right to vote, was passed in 1920. So it happened shortly after World War One, and World War One, because of the efforts put in by women on the home front, World War One was really the event that tipped the women's suffrage movement over to where it was very successful. And Woodrow Wilson, you know, passed the law that or got the amendment passed. Congress passed the amendment, but remember Alice Paul and Jane Addams, those type of women, they were very vocal about women's right to vote. So the whole point of this is that World War One really kickstarted the gave kind of initiated the women's rights to vote in the 19th Amendment. So just remember that. Now going back to World War One and the role of women on the home front, um, in the military, women were obviously not allowed to fight, but they served as either nurses or ambulance drivers on the front lines. So women were needed for that as well, and they served, admirably. They put their lives at risk, and they saved a lot of American lives and other soldiers' lives. And so with that, they gained a lot of respect through their efforts in the military. And then, like at home, like I was saying, due to men serving, women took jobs that were typically held by men, and these women had to they filled jobs in the railroads, they filled jobs as dock workers, bricklayers, coal miners, shipbuilders, ammunition makers, as you can see at the very bottom. Women were an essential workforce during World War One and on the American home front. And then they also volunteered in a variety of ways. Many women also worked as volunteers by serving at Red Cross facilities, which we know what the Red Cross is. And then they also encouraged the sale of bonds, like so they went around to homes, or they were people that sold bonds for the government. And then they also were very obviously instrumental in planting victory gardens for their families and promoting that idea of victory gardens. Here's a propaganda poster for the YWCA. For every fighter, a woman worker, back our line of defense. So this is promoting that behind every soldier on the front lines, there's a woman behind him on the home front, supporting him through work and other ways of supporting the war effort. And then here's a propaganda poster with our Lady Liberty type woman, and it says "Women of America work for victory." And it's got a bunch of vegetables, so I assume it's promoting this victory garden. and this rationing of food. And then here's a propaganda or a recruitment poster for the Red Cross. It says the Red Cross nurse carries our soldiers out of sickness, out of darkness, back to the light of good health. Help the Red Cross. So this is not only a recruiting poster for women to join the Red Cross, but also for people to support the Red Cross as an organization through donations, through other volunteering, stuff like that. All right, and the final thing we're going to talk about is some of the one of the negative aspects of the American Homefront during World War One was it it led to a lot of violence and discrimination and anti-immigration sentiments to the Germans, especially like these German immigrants or descendants of Germans. We're at war with Germany, and you know, what developed was that these rumors of spying and sabotage by the Germans swept the country following the U.S. declaration of war. So you had this belief that the German immigrants or the German ancestors, the German Americans, are somehow um, are tied into sabotaging the home front or spying for Germany, which was simply not the case. Because remember, these immigrants left their home countries for a new life. They oftentimes and avoided or they left because they saw the political tensions that were developing. They saw that rise in militarism. They saw that rise in nationalism. They saw some trouble brewing. So oftentimes these people that left to countries like Germany, they left for reasons. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, they were cut off from their families in Germany, but that also means that they're not like supporting the war or spying for Germany or whatever home country they came from. But Americans believed that this was going on. So this led to this anti-German sentiment, these anti-immigration sentiments, and it escalated to violence where many German Americans were tarred and feathered and beaten. Some were killed, unfortunately. So, you know, if you had a if you were a German immigrant or you had a German last name, you were often a target. It made you stand out, and you were often seen as a target for this violence and discrimination, where many Americans with German names lost their jobs. I mean, you know, you're already needing a workforce for the war effort, and you lose your job simply because your name. So that's pretty amazing to me, and you know, it's unfortunate and it's crazy to think about. But those sentiments were so strong that it forced people to lose their jobs because of their name or their heritage. And then also, you know, towns with German names changed them as well. So, you know, America had a large German immigrant population, so a lot of small towns changed their names during this war. And then like schools even stopped teaching the German language. So you could see that we're at war with the country, and then all of a sudden we're demonizing our fellow Americans just because of their ancestry or where they came from. And you know, the propaganda was used in this way as well. And it did not only help to mobilize the American people to help America and the Allies win the war, but it also did a lot of damage as well. And you know, some German families are they probably suffered irreparable damage to to their livelihood and stuff like that. So it was war is not a good thing, and it does a lot of damage in more ways than just killing on the front lines. It does a lot on the home front as well.